Hi, and thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to talk you through the kind of things you need to look at when you're buying a tent for the first time for wild camping or your backpacking adventures. The sort of tent that you're going to stick in your backpack and go up a hill or a mountain, set it up and spend the night there. The world of tents can be a little bit confusing the first time you start looking at them. There's so many different shapes and designs and features and specifications. And how do you judge whether one is better than another or more suited to you or not? What I'm going to do in this video is talk about the main features you need to be looking at, to think about. So when you look at tents, you can make a better, more informed choice about what's going to be the right one for you, because every tent has advantages and disadvantages. I think for most people when they're starting out, it's very hard to tell what the advantages and disadvantages are. First thing we find out that's comparable between tents that we can actually say, oh, there's a rating, I can actually say this is better than that one, is the hydrostatic head, which is the waterproof amount, let's kind of call it that the tent has. How waterproof is the tent? So manufacturers use something called the hydrostatic head rating, and it doesn't matter what it is, we just kind of see it as the higher the number, the more waterproof tent is. But here's the thing, tent manufacturers kind of use that in order to sell the tent because they know that there isn't much for you to go on other than that. And instead of it just becoming a price war, they can say, oh, this one's more waterproof than that one. You can kind of rule out the hydrostatic head rating. A tent is either waterproof or it isn't. There isn't an in-between. There aren't tents which let in half the rain, don't let in the other half. It doesn't make any sense, right? So the way the hydrostatic head rating works is it's done on pressure. But tents, when it rains, are not really under pressure as such. And so when tent manufacturers make tents, the tents are waterproof. Whether one can take more than another in a lab situation is not going to have any real world application for any of us when we're camping. You might think, well, I just want to have the more waterproof one anyway. But the thing that happens with the hydrostatic head as it goes up is the tear strength generally starts to come down. There's a really good article on the MSR website, which is a big tent manufacturer. They have a really good article about that. If you want to read that in more detail, you could find it on Google, and I'll leave a link in the description for that if you want to read more about it, which will kind of give you some more science to back up what I'm saying. But what I will tell you is that you can ignore the hydrostatic head rating on tents because they really are they're either waterproof or they're not for how we use them. So after now discovering that the hydrostatic head doesn't really mean very much, what can we judge tents on? Actually, all the other kind of categories that you can judge a tent on mean a lot more. So the first one I'm going to look at is the overall shape of a tent. I'm going to use 3 categories for this because I think whilst you could kind of subclassify other types of tent shapes, I don't think it really means very much. So the 3 I'm going to look at is a trekking pole style tent where you use walking poles to put them up. If that's something that makes you think, oh, I haven't thought about that, actually really look at them because they're very, very good. Trekking poles are not just for if you have like a knee injury or you find walking difficult, not at all, in fact. They're designed for everybody to use and they make walking much, much easier, especially uphill and downhill, because it takes some of the strain off your legs, it improves your balance, and you can walk further and faster with them. So it's really worth looking at because they make a really big difference. Now with trekking pole tents, they tend to be very lightweight and they're also often not too expensive. You can get ones that only need 1 pole. Some people like to only walk with 1 pole. But that doesn't mean if you have 2 poles, you can't get a 1-pole tent. The 1-pole tents are usually smaller and they're usually just 1-man tents. The 2-pole tents, where they need 2 trekking poles, are usually 2-man versions. Trekking pole tents are lightweight and relatively affordable. Downside with them would probably be that they can be a little bit more fiddly than some other tents to set up. That's not always the case, but generally speaking, from what I've seen with them, they are a little bit more fiddly to set up. My personal opinion though is I think that they're a really, really good option for people because they do everything well. Now the next type of tent shape that you'll come across often is a tunnel tent. And tunnel tents have poles at intervals that stand alone, they don't cross over. The advantage with them is that because it's just 1 pole, then another pole, another pole. Sometimes they only have 1 pole, but they're quick. You just stick the pole in, peg, and you're pretty much done. The other advantage with the tunnel tents is that they tend to have quite good headroom. That's not always the case though. And I'll come on to headroom as one of the issues later on. but they tend to have quite good headroom. And as you add more poles, you get tents. A tunnel tent, say with 3 poles, usually has an enormous vestibule and a large sleeping area. Like a 3-pole tunnel tent would be really good for the say 2 people that are carrying quite a lot of gear, and a 1-pole tunnel tent could be really lightweight, and a 2-pole tunnel tent might give you a little bit more space. It's a good tent design, but I guess if there were disadvantages, whilst they're quite quick to pitch, they could be a little bit fiddly as you have to peg them whilst you're pitching it. And the other thing is that they're more susceptible to side winds. So normally you pitch the tent into the wind, but if the wind moves around, with a tunnel tent, the poles stand alone because there's no crossover points. They don't ever support each other. So that's one thing to bear in mind with tents, is that when you have one or more pole cross each other, then you get that combined strength of them together. Tunnel tents don't have that. So they're more susceptible to side winds where you could get a pole breakage. They're very much designed to be pointed into the wind, and that's it. But they make very good, very easy to use tents. Now when it comes on to freestanding, the advantages with freestanding are obviously if it's freestanding, you can pick it up and move it to where you want it, which is quite nice to be able to do. But generally speaking, freestanding tents are stronger because they tend to have more crossover points on the poles, which makes them reinforce each other, and that helps. The disadvantages with freestanding tents is that they tend to have smaller vestibule areas. So the porches can be just enough for a bag and somewhere to cook in, but on the upside, a lot of them will have 2 porches. So if there's 2 of you in a tent, you'll get one each, and if it's just you, then you could well find that you've got one to put your gear in and another one to cook in. So that can be an advantage in itself. So if I summarize the shapes up for you, I would say that the trekking pole tents are really good for lightweight if you want to do longer distances, or you just fancy the idea of having a much lighter backpack on. Tunnel tents are generally better if you want more headroom, and especially then if you think about having a much larger vestibule kind of porch area on your tent. And freestanding are really good if you want to pitch in like more awkward places, and if you want to go for maximum strength. Now the next thing you need to look at, and you need to really watch it with this, is the number of people the tent is rated for. This is such a weird situation with tent manufacturers, but it generally kind of works like this. When someone says it's a 1-man tent, it's usually really small, so it's a squeeze. The majority of 2-man tents are tight for 2 people and really comfortable for 1 person, and it kind of goes on like that. So if you're looking at a 1-man tent, the chances are that that's going to be small for 1 person. You're going to feel like there's not much space. It's going to be quite cramped. And if you value having more space for yourself, I suggest you look at a 2-man tent, because the 2-man tents are really 1 man, and 3-man or 2-man. It's that kind of thing. You know, like how it goes with those kind of things. Yeah, it's that all over again. But I'd say for most people, the majority of people are probably going to be happier with a 2-man tent if they're on their own. And they might be okay with a 2-man if there's 2 of them, or if it's just sometimes there's 2 of you. For instance, if you're going on your own most of the time, but sometimes your partner's going to come along just occasionally, then a 2-man would be a good idea. And you don't need to then buy a 2-man and a 1-man. Just get the 2-man and use that. It would be really beneficial if you can go to a camping shop and actually have a look at the tent that you want to buy. But I can tell you most manufacturers are like this. So to summarize that section, I'd say when you're looking at a tent, you're probably going to be looking at getting a 2-man as a 1-man and a 3-man as a 2-man, unless you're okay with being a bit more squeezed in. Some people have a high tolerance for that, and it doesn't matter. So again, that's up to you. Now, another feature which I think people probably won't think about so much is the door configuration. The door configuration really, really matters, and there's a few reasons why. When it comes to the doors, there's the outer doors and the inner doors. What you have to think about is the most important aspect really is, do you want the doors to be at head and feet, or do you want them to be at your sides? Now, I think from what I see, most people prefer the doors to be at the sides, and I'll explain to you why. It's quite straightforward really. When you are in your tent, if you roll over onto your side, you can unzip the door and grab all your stuff without having to get out of bed. And if you sit up and face the door, which is at the side of the tent, all of this stuff's just there. You don't have to like reach into it to get to anything. So for how we are with the range our arms can kind of reach and how we like to sit on things, it's generally easier with side doors to get things. Also, if you're going to have ever somebody along with you, when you have a side doors, if you've got two side doors, you get your own door either side, and it's really nice. I think it's the better layout. It's not always for everyone, and it might be that other features on the tent outweigh it, but that's generally how I think it goes. Now, one of the other big factors is actually the height of the tent. You have to think about when you're in the tent, do you want to be able to sit up in that? Because if you want to get changed and move things around and be in the tent for any length of time, think about if in the winter and it's dark for 16 hours and you're in the tent, or if it's raining and you don't want to get out of the tent because it's pouring with rain, and if you sit up, your head goes like this against the top of it, and then you're trying to change and you're doing all this kind of stuff with your arms. If your head space is below about 95 or 100 centimeters, you can work that out in inches, then it gets very, very cramped very quickly. The other thing you have to look at is that height just in the middle, or is it continuous across for an area? If it's just in the middle, you can find that whilst you can sit up, there's not much space to move around that, which can be difficult in itself. You'd want to have a tent that doesn't necessarily come down at a harsh angle, but there's maybe more like this, so you can see that you're going to get more space around you. That can make life a lot easier. It's important also to notice with the foot end of the tent where your feet will be, that how sharp does that come down? Because sometimes it comes down so sharply that your sleeping bag will push up against the wall of the inner tent, and you can get condensation leaking into your sleeping bag, and then the sleeping bag can get wet. So you don't want the foot end of the inner tent to come down at too sharp an angle. That can be a problem in some tunnel tents. Some tents are really low down. You can get some one-man tents in particular that are very low to the ground. And why do they do that? Well, something to bear in mind is that the higher the tent goes, the more of a profile it has to the wind. So you're gonna find a taller tent catches the wind more, and a lower tent is generally more aerodynamic and wind resistant. So whilst it can feel like, oh, I'll just go for the highest tent I can find if I want loads of space, that doesn't always pay off that well, because you can end up with something that's a bit of a sail. With the height of the tent and the shape of the tent, you have to look at, does the tent look aerodynamic? Because it's all very well having a slightly higher tent, let's say it's 100 centimeters, which isn't particularly high, but it's a good kind of area to aim for. If it has really steep walls, if the wind hits those, you could be in trouble. So that's where you have to start looking at the shape of what you're getting. Are there any walls that are kind of getting towards more vertical? That can be a problem in higher wind speeds. But the height of the tent will dictate that, because you can have like steepish walls, but if it's not very high, it's going to shed the wind anyway. But if they come up higher, then it's going to catch the wind more. So it's worth bearing in mind the effects of that. Now, the next thing you need to think about is the weight of the tent. I think people don't initially look at the weight of things very much. Most people, when they start out camping, they just buy things that they can afford, which is fine, they should do that, but they buy things without paying attention to what the weight is, because you don't necessarily have to spend a lot in order to get a lighter weight tent. In fact, some tents that are really expensive are also really heavy. You don't always get a good weight reduction as you spend more money, but generally what happens as you spend more money is you get more strength. But the weight of the tent will matter, because when you add on more and more gear, the rucksack can get to a point where it's quite hard to carry. So that might be where you start thinking about, actually maybe that trekking pole tent isn't so bad after all. Perhaps that does look like it's an attractive option. So how much do tent weights vary? Well, a trekking pole tent might weigh around 800 grams. A four-season freestanding tent could weigh 4 kilograms, which is significantly more. You have to really think about how are you going to carry all your gear and how much is it all going to weigh. So the weight of all of your gear is something that I'd urge you to pay attention to straight away. Don't just think, oh, I'll get the biggest rucksack I can and I'll just shove everything into it and just carry it. That's not going to get you very far. You see a lot of people carrying far too much stuff and it's really heavy, and it makes it very difficult for them to get to where they want to go to because it's just too heavy. And that doesn't mean you have to go into the ultralight and trying to make everything super lightweight, but it is worth, when you're looking at tents, thinking, well, if you've got 3 tents that you're looking at seriously, compare the weights of them, because it does make a difference. And I think every half a kilo or pound of weight that you can save starts to make a difference. And the weight on your back when you're carrying it in a rucksack makes much more of a difference than the weight on your body, because it's off your center of gravity. And that means that it's going to pull on you. You're going to feel it much more. And the other thing you need to consider is inner or outer pitch. Generally speaking, outer pitch tents can be defined as you put the poles through parts of or clips onto the outer fly sheet and the tent hangs off it. And with an inner tent pitch first, you put the poles into or clip the inner tent onto the poles, and the fly sheet then sits on top of it. There's advantages and disadvantages, but one issue that people talk about most is that if you're in a country where it rains a lot, with an inner tent pitch first, you're going to get rain coming into the inside of the inner tent before you can put the fly sheet on. In my opinion, I think that there is truth to that, but I also think it can be a little bit exaggerated. If you're used to pitching the tent and you're quick, I personally don't think you should make a big deal out of it, because the inner tent pitch first has some benefits as well, and it tends to be that they have a bigger inner tent space because the poles are pushing it out, pulling the shape out. The fly sheet tends to stretch over the inner tent better, so you tend to have a quieter tent. It doesn't flap about in the wind as much because everything's being pushed out by the poles. With an outer pitch first, everything's hanging off the poles, so everything's just like loose and flaps around, and they're very loud tents. But they have the advantage that with outer pitch, that it can all go up in one. You can leave the inner tent connected and just put the poles up when it's raining, and your inner tent will stay dry. So that is a big advantage, and I think that probably in wet countries where it rains more, people are going to go for the outer pitch for probably more likely than an inner pitch first. But on the other hand, if you live in a warm country, or you're going to use your tent most in the summer, with an inner pitch first, you don't actually have to put that fly sheet on top. You could just put the inner tent up with the poles on it and sleep in that, and you'll have a much cooler time. You'll be sleeping effectively in a strong bug net. So it's pros and cons, and I personally wouldn't let the inner or outer pitch thing put you off. I'd mostly rule it out unless you're someone who's wanting to go out often in really awful conditions. If that's your thing, then I would veer more towards outer pitch first. Or if you're really going to be going in really warm conditions, you're just going to go in the middle of summer and it's warm in your country, then yeah, I'd probably go for an inner pitch first. I think it's going to be easier to live with. But outside of that, I think I wouldn't worry about that so much. So to summarize, I think what you need to do when you look at tents, you need to look at the shape of the inner tent. Look at the measurements at the ends and the middle, and think, what's that going to be like to be in? Because you need a tent that's going to have some space, some height at the ends and in the middle. It doesn't have to be the same height all the way across, but if it tapers off really strongly at the base, or if you've got a bit of height at the foot end, that makes a big difference, because you can have tents that initially look similar, but when you look at the foot end, one could be considerably higher than the other. That makes a difference for your sleeping bag and your head height inside. Is it 100 centimeters, for instance, at some point, but does it tail off really quickly, or is it more gradual? Those are the things that are going to make a difference when you're in your inner tent. And the same goes for the outer tent as well. Are you going to be able to easily access the porch area? It's just the actual living space and usable space that you have. And I'd really stress that for you. It's about usable space. And I would just leave you with one kind of final tip when it comes to tents, which is not something you would select a tent by, but I just want to say it because I think it's relevant. And that is that once you get your tent, don't think that those pegs that it comes with are going to be up to much. Usually the tent pegs that you get with a manufacturer aren't particularly good. If you're going to get into wild camping more seriously, I would say to you, there's kind of two types of tent pegs that are really good. One is just the ones that are like a nail because they'll go into hard ground. And the other one is the ones which look like a Y shape. There's like 3 fins on it, if you like. They're really good because they hold well in soft ground. And it's better to be able to take the right kind of peg for the job. Those, what they call candy cane pegs that often come with a tent, or sometimes you get ones that are like that, but they're flat. Most of the time, they're pretty awful. You're going to really rely on the pegs to keep your tent upright, because if the pegs go, the tent falls. So don't think that they're not important. And that goes for freestanding as well, because in high winds, if the guy lines go, the poles are likely to snap. They need the guy lines to support them. So it's really worth thinking about changing your pegs over. Please subscribe if you thought that was useful. I could do with some more subscribers, that would be great. And give me a thumbs up as well. Anyway, take care and join me again soon on my next video. Bye-bye.